Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's a bittersweet episode this week, as it's the 200th and final episode of This Week in Immigration. BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal sits down with Henry Cisneros, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Chair of the Bipartisan Policy Center Board of Directors, and Co-Chair of BPC's Immigration Task Force, to talk about BPC's involvement in immigration over the last decade, the work done and still needing to be done as we wrap BPC's work in this space. It's a look back and a look ahead, so stay tuned.
The Bipartisan Policy Center entered the debate on immigration reform in 2013 with the launch of a bipartisan task force on immigration. As we wrap up our time at BPC and record the final BPC episode of This Week in Immigration, we look back at the work of the task force and of the Bipartisan Policy Center over these last 12 years. Between 2013 and 2018, BPC convened the task force, a politically diverse group comprised of business and labor leaders, key immigration advocates, and former Republican and Democratic elected and appointed officials to work together and come up with consensus recommendations on how to update the U.S. immigration system. 3 such statements of policy recommendations were released by this group, whose co-chairs included former Secretaries Condoleezza Rice and Michael Chertoff, as well as former governors Haley Barbour and Ed Rendell. The 4th co-chair was Henry Cisneros, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who joins us today. Mr. Secretary, welcome to This Week in Immigration.
Theresa, thank you very much for your work as far back as that task force. But then in all the intervening years, you've been a credit to the BPC and added real credibility to the voice of the BPC in the national debate. So thank you.
Oh, I really appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. But let's talk about you real quick for a second. Can you tell us how you first started working with the Bipartisan Policy Center before the immigration work?
I was out of public office at the time. I had been a member of President Clinton's cabinet until 1997, was president of Univision Communications, the Spanish language broadcaster based in Los Angeles. Then I went into my own business starting in 2000 and was working away one day when I got a call asking me to be part of a BPC task force on the budget and deficit. It was jointly chaired by Senator Domenici of New Mexico, former senator at that time, and Alice Rivlin, who had been the head of the Office of Management and Budget. He a Republican, she a Democrat. And I served on that task force, a very distinguished group of people, and kind of fell in love with the concept of the BPC and its work. I subsequently was asked to be on a housing task force that followed that one. And it too was meticulously balanced in its leadership and in its membership. On this one, I was a co-chair on housing after the Great Recession. What would we do to get the country back on track with respect to housing policy and address some of the root causes of the Great Recession to the degree that they were housing related? Again, really was deeply impressed by the BPC, and then over time was asked to serve on the board. But during that period, the former head of the Bipartisan Policy Center, Jason Grumet, asked me to host him in a meeting in the Southwest, in San Antonio, to really pull together a group of people who could help him determine whether or not the BPC had a place and should help in the immigration discussion. I pulled together that meeting in San Antonio. It was a robust discussion. And days later, Jason called me back to thank me for having organized that, but to say that it guaranteed for him a sense that the BPC should definitely be involved in immigration, bring its unique ability to bipartisanly bring people together and its unique concept of working on bipartisan solutions. Jason had a saying that had guided him since he created the BPC, that no one was being asked to leave their partisan roots at the door. Bring them in and use them to help find bipartisan solutions. That was the concept in all of these things I've described: budget, housing, and every other task force that the BPC did. And I love that about the BPC.
So how were you approached about co-chairing the immigration task force after that?
Well, after Jason concluded, based on his trip to San Antonio and other cities, that this was an area for the BPC to work. Obviously, when the BPC takes on a subject, it also needs to understand, is there sufficient interest out there in the corporate and philanthropic community to make it possible to staff it properly. Jason called me and we got involved on that together. In fact, I think I made some trips with him to try to articulate the wisdom of this to foundations, for example. And then he called me and asked me to join Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, and Haley Barbour, former governor of Mississippi and chairman of the Republican Party, as the two Republicans, and I would join Ed Rendell, former governor of Pennsylvania and head of the Democratic Party, as the two Democrats. So we put that group together along with people like Michael Chertoff, who had been the Secretary of Homeland Security, and labor leaders and Latino leaders, a group of about 16 people, 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, all of whom had some credentials on the issue.
Yeah. So let me ask you, why were you personally interested in the immigration work? What brought you to that?
Well, I've been more than interested, but sort of deeply engaged and involved in immigration issues for 30 plus years. As mayor of San Antonio, I was mayor of a city with a large immigrant population, and I live in the poorest census tract in the city. And I used to say, for me, it's not an abstract issue. It's as current as going out in the street in my neighborhood and seeing people who probably arrived last night, or going to church and worshiping with people who have been here a few weeks and are still living with other family members. Very, very real. But beyond that, as a person who was involved in the Latino leadership of the country, working with the likes of then Southwest Council of La Raza, now called Unidos, and labor all over the southern United States, Maldef, the law firm for the Latino community, Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and many others, it was impossible to avoid the immigration issue when all of these organizations were so deeply involved. And it was, for many Latinos, the number one concern on their list of concerns. And then, of course, from a personal standpoint, historic standpoint, my grandfather and grandmother came from Mexico during the Revolution as immigrants and made their life here. They had 5 boys serve in the United States military, 3 of them during World War II. And they were surrounded by all of the accoutrements of American life. I used to say our neighborhood felt like a Norman Rockwell portrait, only all the faces were brown. We were Mexicans, yeah. Mexican Americans. Yeah. And I lived in a neighborhood where when people asked me about discrimination, I said, I don't know the concept, because everybody in my neighborhood are supporting each other, working together. There's no segregation or discrimination. We're all Latinos. So the whole concept of people coming back and forth from Mexico, some as workers, some as travelers, some as family members visiting, some as intellectuals, professors, and journalists. I grew up in that milieu.
Yeah. So you mentioned the fellow co-chairs when you started. Did you know any of your fellow co-chairs at that point, or any of the other members of the task force? And what were your expectations at the beginning?
Well, I did know Governor Rendell, for example, on the Democratic side, but I also had met Condoleezza Rice, and I've been involved in bipartisan things for a long time. I was 23 years old when I was selected to be a White House fellow, and that was in the years that President Nixon was president. So I have for a long time been listening to people whose ideas I don't necessarily agree with, but having to think it through and forge common ground. So I did know a number of the people, and I had great respect for them, and I think was helpful in selecting them, because I was an early co-chair, and the question then was, well, who do we need to balance this off, and what labor person out there should we bring aboard, et cetera. But my expectations were that we would be able, as has been done by the BPC in other areas, to sort of lay out some solutions. One of the things that I love about the BPC is that it doesn't necessarily have the answer that is going to be the final answer, but it does break ground and say the things that the political people holding office today, elected or appointed, can't say. So putting things on the table that show a solution is possible. Not easy, but possible. And that changes the discussion a little bit, because once you know there is a way to do this, you have to at least consider it. Yeah. And it may be politically impossible, politically difficult, but you can't say there's no way This is an absolute Gordian knot, impossible to resolve. You can't say that if somebody's laying out a strategy, a sequence of action.
So let's talk a little bit about the work of the task force and how it worked together. How did you and the other members of the task force work together on the recommendations? What are some of your recollections of the meetings that you had?
Well, like every other BPC effort, and we rely heavily on the BPC staff. The BPC now has about 150 people. So it's a very robust, very substantial staffing group. And Theresa, your role was very key at that point. Jason was the one, I presume, who brought you on board. I presume that was a one-on-one decision, interview that you did with Jason. But we as a committee inherited you.
Yeah, that's true.
And you came with a great reputation, having worked in the Homeland Department, having worked, my recollection, at the Chamber of Commerce and other places around Washington, where you brought a kind of a balanced and reasonable view. You had relationships with the people who were basically, progressives on immigration, even open border advocates, and people, on the other hand, who represented business and were thought of as the conservative or business voice on immigration, but they recognized the country needs some level of immigration. And you had sufficient credibility that you could listen to other people from the think tanks, from Heritage and Cato and American Enterprise Institute and other places. So you brought a lot of not only ideas, but familiarity with the concepts to the table. And the way that the committee worked, as you will remember, is the committee would discuss its views, debate some questions, reach some points of agreement, and then you would take those and try to devise sort of policy implications from that common ground. Then the next meeting, you would come back with those things which we reviewed, and we would refine them further and see whether there were things we could agree upon for a report. In those days, the concept of immigration reform was still the key. And when people talked about immigration reform, there was a kind of a rough consensus that went from Ted Kennedy on the one hand to leading Republicans like Haley Barbour on the other, that went something like this. One, we need to protect the border because a sovereign nation has a right to have borders and determine who comes in and who comes out. So there needs to be some sort of regulatory mechanism for the border. Secondly, we have in those days, it was thought of as about 10 million people or so in the country who were here illegally, and there needed to be some mechanism to regularize them. I use those words advisedly. Regularize, meaning bring them into some kind of a system, not just out there in the country, but into some mechanism where they're on some kind of a status, a work status, long-term perhaps, but regularized and legal in some legal structure. And then the third element had to do with an eventual path to citizenship, a way to become citizens after they had proven their fealty to the country, observation of its laws, history of living in community, of contributing in the workplace, and very importantly, perhaps paid some sort of retribution fee or something in order to get onto a citizenship track. So am I right that those are roughly the three elements
the
that
other
we
big
discussed?
one that we talked a lot about was legal immigration,
Yes,
family
of course.
reunification, business visas. We talked a lot about that as well.
Numbers, there were actually numbers
Yeah, we were trying
for
to
what
figure
had
out.
what had been the norm, and it was about 800,000 a year, as I
Yeah,
recall.
between 800,000
That
and a
was
million a year. And we were trying to
and
figure
a
out, is that
million
the
a
right
year.
number, too low, too high?
Right.
Is it the right balance between family
But
and
that number
business?
had been sort of accepted for years and years.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a 20-year history of allowing in around that number. And then, of course, there were issues about who the 800,000 should be. Should it be people coming in as refugees from violent regimes? Should it be people who already had family here and family reunification? Should it be people coming in who had special skills in the workforce, the H-1B category of people? Should it be people who were a different kind of workers, manual workers, laborers, farm workers, construction workers there was a need for them in certain industries? Those were all subsets of that question of, 800,000.
Yeah. Do you remember, from your perspective, what consensus areas came more easily and what was more difficult to reach consensus on?
Well, interestingly enough, I think there was a general kind of consensus that all three of those were important and all three had to have a place in a final resolution. One, there maybe have some minute portion of the population that agreed that there should but not be, border enforcement, but I don't remember that as being ever being a significant line of argument. I mean, when today people are attacked because somebody advocated open borders, I never heard anything about that. There may have been some subset of, progressives who go back to the language of Aztlán or the Mexican ceding of territory to the United States that would say, well, we never crossed the border crossed us, was a line that people used to use. But nobody, really felt like the right solution was no border enforcement. Everybody agreed. And I have always felt, and I use this language, a sovereign nation really isn't a nation if it doesn't have definitive borders on the ground. And if it has borders, then they have to mean something. So there was that people agreed to. On the issue of those who are here undocumented, there's been a general sense over the years that it's better to have people legalized. And that's some of what President Reagan did on his watch, is set up mechanisms for legalization of people. Use language like, we don't believe in having permanent second-class citizens. The creation of a permanent underclass in the United States of people who are outside the law and will remain outside the law. There was some consensus about legalization. And then path to citizenship, it also had many adherents, including Republicans, who felt that if a person is here for 10 years, this is not an easy path, and it's not a short path. It was, in those days, as I recall, a 10 or 12 or 13-year path to check all the boxes that would get you to citizenship. Very tough.
I recall Secretary Rice being particularly strong about the idea that we should not accept the idea that some people can never become citizens in the United States.
Correct.
Because she felt that was kind of antithetical to who we are as a nation. That allowing or encouraging people or preventing people from getting citizenship like that would undermine our own sense of citizenship in some way. And I remember hearing her very eloquently talk about those viewpoints.
Well, there was that. And then there was also the view that failing to address the legalization question would just look the other way, pretend they didn't exist, and live with the reality of this underclass bereft of benefits, forced into extreme measures of sustaining themselves, right? And there came this subterranean society within America. Not a good idea for any country. So there was that discussion. And so there was an understanding that some legalization path would be required. It even involved requiring people to go back and then come back.
Yeah, I remember we talked
status.
about sort of leave and come back, some touchback. We talked about a lot of what are the so-called remedies or penalties that somebody might have to pay to kind of get their status back on track. I remember talking a lot of different ideas.
Yeah. And then the issue of the quote of the overall number, I don't think we did a lot on that, because that is a traditional issue within immigration law and in the Congress, the number that are allowed in. And then special statuses like refugees, for example, from Afghanistan, because they helped us in the war there, or like Vietnamese who were allowed in because they helped, and they would be killed if they remained in Vietnam. That was in the 1960s. So I thought there was a lot of consensus.
Yeah.
I thought there was a lot of consensus.
We did manage to put out 2 different papers on Room for Consensus, so there was a fair amount of consensus to be had.
The Americans tend to forget that we were making very substantial progress on immigration reform. As close as President of Mexico coming to meet with President Bush, or scheduled to meet with President Bush, I should say, just before 9/11, and having a pre-meeting consensus on the shape of immigration reform. And then 9/11 happened, and the narrative became, the threat we face is from the southern border, even though the terrorists who flew the planes on 9/11 into the towers and into the Pentagon came across the northern border.
Well, actually, they didn't do that either, but they did not come from Mexico. That much is true. I remember I was at the chamber at that time, and the chamber and AFL and Unidos or La Raza at that time, the three organizations had come together to testify in Congress about the need for immigration reform literally the week before 9/11. Like it was.
Yeah. And then there was another close moment in the 2006 or so era.
Yeah.
Maybe a little later than that.
Kennedy McCain efforts.
Yeah, that would have been what, like
That
2006 something.
6, 7, and 8. There were like three different times.
Right. And it came to a Senate vote, and it was very, very close, including some senators who expected to vote for it, who at the last minute didn't, and was the only reason why we didn't have immigration reform then. And now, of course, we're so far from talk of reform, so far from any of these concepts getting any traction whatsoever.
Yeah. So, obviously we didn't see immigration legislation passed during the time of the task force or since. But what do you think the task force did have an impact nevertheless?
Well, I think that one of the beauties of the BPC is it lays out for people who may be skeptical about a given course of action that there is a path. It is doable. That really is one of the beauties of the BPC approach. And I think we did that. I think we also were able to allow people on all sides of the debate to, look at something. Yes, they might disagree with portions, but it creates the sense of how far or close we are. What's the magnitude of the differences? Are they resolvable or not? I think that's a very positive thing to be able to contribute. And frankly, I think BPC's biggest contribution, Theresa, was your role in the debate. Seriously.
Listeners, I promise I did not ask him to say any of this stuff about me, just in case.
I think that you're being at all the meetings, getting known to people as a reasonable voice, being there with facts and data, and the task force work had to be pluses. And I've been very proud over the years when I talk to people about, who are the movers and shakers in the discussion on immigration, and your name comes up and the BPC comes up because of you. So yeah, I think that was useful. There are things that happen in life that are just beyond your control. You can't even be sorry about them because they're just like facts of life. 9/11 and the subsequent attitudes on immigration, and President Trump coming down the escalator announcing for president with immigration and denigration of immigrants as the central theme of his early campaign. They're just things we could not have foreseen. And it's been it's an impossible situation to work with. So we've had very little, what you could call, progress. There's been a moment there where DACA looked like it was a possible point of consensus, and I think it was with a lot of people.
Yeah, and we did put out a report that in 2018 trying to see if we could help forge that consensus.
Right. President Obama's, executive order on DACA, basically giving people status. All of those were high moments, but the main current, the big drift, has been away from constructive answers, and yet the need is more acute and severe than ever. I guess, in order to be bipartisan and balanced, I have to say that President Trump has done some things in both of his terms that could have been construed as solutions, in that it moved the ball forward for some people, like attention to the border. That in effect had to be done in order for the rest of the ideas of reform to occur. And I will restate, a sovereign nation has a right to control its borders. So there have been some things that you could say, well, we got that established. Now we should be able to go on to the rest of the conversation. But the turn that it has taken, demonizing people, and more recently, enforcement actions that go way beyond the pale. I think a lot of people that would have understood when President Trump's second term began that there needed to be some enforcement of the large numbers that were in the country. But as he said, there are criminal elements, gang elements, drug-related elements that need to be identified and taken out. That is a true statement, and that should be done. But now we have people who've been in the country for 30 years, raised a family, working hard, set up a business, have their family involved in the business, and they're being removed. And the tactics that are being removed of taking people at their places of worship. I saw a tape the other day of Chicago with ICE agents in the hallways of the hospital looking for people who may be coming to visit relatives in the hospital. Well, that's not the concept that I think we understood as a country and that many people supported when President Trump talked about it in the last campaign. So we're in a very different place. And I don't know how we're going to come back from this.
Yeah. What do you think might be necessary for Republicans and Democrats to work together again on this issue, particularly in Congress? Do you think that there's room in Congress for some bipartisanship on this issue?
I'm sorry to say that I don't believe there is, because so much depends upon the leadership articulation of the problem. And the way President Trump has articulated the problem, it's as if all are criminals, all need to be deported. There doesn't seem to be any room for a reasonable or moderate position. So members of the Congress cannot buck the president. Members of his party cannot buck the president without fear of retribution. So I don't see, as long as the voice is that demonizing voice, I don't know where this is going to end. I don't know how this plays out. This fever that we have right now. I think there will be consequences. I was reading this morning a piece on housing affordability, and there are a lot of reasons for the lack of supply and production in the country today that contribute to housing unaffordability, including companies that went out of business in the Great Recession, and including difficulties of high costs of materials, imported aluminum and wood, etc. In part, tariffs gets involved in that. But one of the big problems has to be that the workforce, a lot of the workforce has been decimated. They're either gone or they're underground, but they're not in places where they were working before on the roofs of houses, finishing off the roofs and doing the interior plumbing and electrical work and laying the foundation. They're not doing that. So it may be that at some point, both in housing as well as agriculture and other areas, the business community says, wait a minute, this is beginning to do real damage to our ability to produce, and we're not able to find other workers. And there will be some kind of a moment, a little sort of spot of light, a little clarity that says, okay, let's figure out how to let numbers of people come in and do the jobs that we have proven no one else will do and are needed, essential, basic to the economy of the country.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the moment. Maybe that's the moment where some compromise is possible.
So I remember Jason used to talk about this, and frankly, Margaret Spellings, our current president, says this too, that one of the benefits of a place like the Bipartisan Policy Center is to kind of be the demonstration project for what Congress can do if it wants to. So let me ask you, do you think that a bipartisan task force such as the one you were part of could work today? Do you think if we brought together a similar group of people, maybe coming from the Trump administration and the Biden administration and others, do you think it would be able to reach consensus? And do you think that could, again, show the way for members of Congress to kind of think about it?
That's an interesting point, and I commend you for even thinking that way, because I do believe that there needs to be bipartisan conversation. I don't know where the end game is here on this path. I don't know where it ends, but maybe that's the place to begin, by having a group of people sit down and talk about, when have we done enough? When do we think we've got the situation stabilized? When do you think it's possible to begin to talk about the end game here? And then after that, the beginnings of serious discussion about steps that help the economy by allowing certain kinds of workers, border enforcement related questions at a time when we have this massive trade flow between U.S. and Mexico. So we know we need each other. We know we need each other, at least with respect to commerce, our largest trading partner, and production there. We have new areas of potential production, like an automotive cluster that runs from Texas down through Monterrey and Guanajuato, León, other places in Mexico. 400,000 people working in the automotive cluster and parts coming into the United States for assembly in the United States. Very robust, powerful economic generator that solves issues of poverty in one of the more impoverished areas of the country. South Texas and northern Mexico. There are upsides. There are reasons for collaborating, building a stronger economy. But we have to understand first, where is the end of the present strategy? When is enough enough?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the Bipartisan Policy Center is wrapping up its work on immigration. Maybe we'll come back to it at some point in the future. But just a last question, what are your thoughts about the work of
Well,
BPC over the
BPC
last
may be
decade?
BPC may be wrapping up its work, but I hope you are not. And whatever you do next,
Look, I've been doing this too long to quit now. I will find some
yeah,
way to stay
yeah,
involved. But I
yeah.
did want to ask you just sort of
Well,
what are your
I think it's more than staying involved. I think it's you offering up some solutions from your experience and wisdom. I'd love to see a parting paper from Theresa Brown on how do we call it a successful endeavor in what has been done. I use the word successful speaking from the Republican side.
yeah,
What
what
would
does
they what would
success look like?
what does success looks like for the Republicans? And then from there, how do we reconstruct in a way that doesn't have some of the vices of the previous, letting some people in that shouldn't have been in, etc.? How do we reconstruct that doesn't have some of the downsides of the previous efforts, but speaks to the welfare, to the benefit, to the security of our own country? And I wish you would do that, or at a minimum, work with us at the BPC to organize an ad hoc kind of group. Maybe it's just a one-time sitting, for all I know, that begins the conversation.
But we'll see what happens. I have been thinking a lot, one of the upsides, if you will, of tearing down a building is you get a chance to build a new one,
Hmm.
hopefully better than the one that came down. So, if we are seeing a lot of tearing down of our immigration system, there's an opportunity to build something better back up. So what that looks like, I think we have to see. But Mr. Secretary, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us for the podcast. Thank you for all of your work on the task force and for your work for the Bipartisan Policy Center on our board of directors and as chair. Your support has been long time and really appreciated here.
Teresa, thank you. And I use that word advisedly, Teresa, because Teresa and Teresa are in my world interchangeable. And Teresa is the Hispanic version of your name, which you have been a great friend of the American Hispanic community, the national Latino community.
Yeah, thank
Teresa
you.
Cardinal
Cardinal
Brown.
Brown. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Secretary.
Yeah.
Stay tuned. We'll wrap up in just a minute. Hi there. This is Theresa again. I'm taking a moment of personal privilege here at the end of the episode. As you have heard, this will be the last episode of This Week in Immigration. We reached episode 200, a pretty significant milestone for any podcast, but like all good things, it has to come to an end. I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for its support of the Immigration Project and bipartisan immigration reform for the last 13 years, and especially for this podcast, which has become both a personal passion project for me and has been a source of information, background, and insight into immigration policy and politics during some of the most significant years in immigration. We truly hope you have found it useful. I want to thank all the hosts, collaborators, and guests we have had over the years on the podcast who have made this endeavor both fun and interesting. I could not have done it without each of you. As for me, I will be ending my time at BPC at the end of this year, but don't worry, I'm staying in the immigration space. You may see me on LinkedIn or on a Substack writing articles or at various events and panels. I also hope to start another podcast to continue our conversations with key players, talk about important research, and understand what's going on behind the headlines of immigration reform. So stay tuned on those platforms for word of where you might find this new podcast where it launches. Finally, I want to thank you, the listeners. I've been amazed at how this podcast has grown and the number of times I have been surprised when I'm at events or on Capitol Hill when someone has told me that they are a regular listener and have found this podcast helpful. That's the main reason we've kept it going for so long. Immigration is a complicated issue that impacts many parts of our collective lives in America, and yet which is so much a part of who we are. I continue to have hope that as a country we will find a way through to fix what is broken, support what is good and works, and retain our status as a nation of immigrants. Thank you, and so long for now.
And that's a final wrap on This Week in Immigration. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. The Bipartisan Policy Center covers many other important issues, including economic and fiscal policy, workforce, housing, healthcare, energy, and more that you can find at bipartisanpolicy.org. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown and written by Theresa Cardinal Brown, with audio editing by Theresa Cardinal Brown. So long from This Week in Immigration.